Good afternoon. This is Fred Trays from REMI, and today we're going to be speaking about the economic modeling of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, we're going to be showing the REMI model's new DEI features that provide a practical solution to evaluating the DEI impacts of policies. So today we'll be addressing a very critical issue for policy evaluation and presenting how this works in a practical, pragmatic tool to answer these questions. So I'd like to introduce the other members of the REMI team here and who have been all involved in preparing this presentation today. And then following that, Katy, who's the lead on this, will deliver the presentation, and Haozheyi and I will stay on through the presentation, and we'll come back during the Q&A session. So first, I'd like to introduce Katy Koon, who's a REMI analyst. She joins us after working at the Governor Finance Offers Association in Chicago, and has a BA from Clemson University and a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. Also today is Haozheyi Guan, an analyst here at REMI, who has an MA in International Economics and Finance from Johns Hopkins University, pardon me, and BA in Economics from Beijing Normal University. From our marketing team, Dee Scott joins us. Dee has a BS in marketing from Louisiana State University and will be moderating the Q&A session today. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today and taking the time out of your schedule. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Katy.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. As Fred introduced, we'll be speaking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in regional economic modeling, specifically looking at some of our new DEI capabilities here as part of our REMI models. So to get started, I wanted to kind of set the stage for how this webinar is going to go. The key questions we're looking at are, first of all, what is DEI? Why do we need DEI analysis of public policy? And how does economic modeling help with DEI analysis of public policy? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, for the purposes of this presentation, are going to refer to the following definitions. For diversity, we will be speaking about race and ethnicity, gender, income category, geography, meaning like rural versus suburban versus urban geographies, and educational attainment level. So these will be the categories which we'll be able to look at later on in our simulations. When we speak about equity, we are referring to fair treatment of everybody and equal access to resources and support. And finally, when we speak about inclusion, we are referring to the idea that nobody be left behind by public policies. So with those basic definitions in mind, the next question is why should we care? Why do we need to evaluate the DEI impacts of public policies? So first of all, I mean, public policy, as the name indicates, should serve the interests of the public, the whole public, not just select segments or select groups. And in order to ensure that policy effects are in fact broad-based, we need to evaluate how different groups are affected by policies. Finally, with the Biden administration and increasing attention called to these DEI impacts, there are now federal requirements for agencies to determine whether and to what extent their policies and programs are perpetuating inequities. And also state and local regulations are increasingly focusing on these issues as well. The federal DEI mandates that went into effect early this year when the administration took office essentially mandated that agencies evaluate these impacts. These executive orders reversed the previous administration's executive orders on equity issues and recognized disparities across racial and ethnic identities, genders, geographic regions, and educational attainment levels. Again, state, metro, and local requirements are also looking to see the impacts of policies and programs on different demographic groups. And increasingly, stakeholder concerns also want to take into account DEI impacts of a policy before it's implemented. So the dimensions of DEI that we will be looking at today include income distribution by quintile, jobs by race and ethnicity, jobs by educational level, and labor force participation. So the questions that our modeling will seek to answer are, do policies benefit all income levels? Do they increase or reduce income inequality? Do all racial and ethnic groups benefit from policies? Are we creating jobs for those without higher education? And are all demographic groups brought into the labor force by this policy change? So to begin looking at these DEI impacts and their importance to economic modeling, I first wanted to just take a moment to introduce ourselves, who we are at REMI, in case you are not familiar with us. We are Regional Economic Modeling Incorporated, and we're the leading public policy analysis models for over 40 years. Our models include our flagship PI Plus Policy Insight model, Tax PI, which specifically looks at dynamic physical and economic effects of policies, Transight, which looks at transportation projects and policies, and E3 Plus, which can be used to analyze the interaction of energy, environment, and the economy. So the REMI models and the DEI module specifically, which we'll be focusing on today, add these dimensions mentioned on the previous slide of race and ethnicity, gender, education level, and geography, as well as income distribution dimensions to public policy analysis. DEI is important to economic modeling, but I think that the best way to illustrate that is to jump into an example to show how DEI does relate, in fact, to economic modeling. So the first example we will look at is a land use and transportation accessibility project example. In this scenario, we will be looking at a metro region with, we'll be using DC as an example. And in this situation, we are looking at a suburban, the suburban part of this metro area being higher income, higher housing prices, and predominantly white. And this situation here will be that suburban office jobs are difficult and unaffordable to reach from the urban center, whereas suburban residents can relatively easily get to downtown jobs. Then the urban demographics include lower income communities and higher concentrations of Black and Latinx workers. So the transportation from city neighborhoods to the new suburban office park is difficult. And the scenario that we will be modeling will be to increase accessibility for all people in the region. So as I mentioned, we'll be simulating this using the DC metro area. Looking at this DC metro area census map, we can see some pretty stark contrasts in racial distribution across the geography of DC. Each point here represents 25 people, and the red points represent white populations, the blue points represent Black populations, and the green and orange points represent Asian and Hispanic communities, respectively. The metro lines are represented in brown here, and the roads are represented in gray. I think that sort of the key part of this image that I want to draw attention to is this clear divide between especially white and Black spatial distribution in the area, and how it's positioned around these transportation lines. Also, to again drive home that idea that the transportation accessibility is important for these DEI questions, is to show that workers without a vehicle are much more often Latino, African American, or Asian American, and white populations tend to have less of an issue with having a vehicle and having the mobility to get to different jobs in different areas of the city. So jumping into the REMI model and looking at this transportation accessibility problem, we're modeling the DC metro area. The scenario will be a transportation improvement, and we will focus only on the accessibility component of this scenario. And the inputs to the model that we used were an increase in labor access index by 0.5%, and we're looking over the time horizon from 2021 to 2030. Also, at this point, just for ease of presentation, I will be showing screenshots from the model, but I do want to note that if anybody has an interest in seeing the model in action, and seeing how it's used live and how a user would interact with it, we're more than happy to set up some meetings to take you or colleagues or your organization through how the DEI module actually will work. So looking at the economic summary of results from this transportation accessibility example, first of all, we see kind of a lot of positive effects. We see an increase in total employment. We see an increase in the labor force. We see an increase in GDP, increase in output, and increase in personal income. This graph shows for the Washington metropolitan area, so all the regions combined, not just the city. This shows the employment by industry, by income quintile. So here we see that the Transportation Accessibility Project increased employment for the second 20% quintile and the lowest 20% quintile, sort of as was intended by this policy. And across the board, across all industries, we saw an increase in employment. Looking specifically at demographics, so getting into this DEI component, here we see the racial breakdown of populations affected by this policy change. So we see increases for employment for the white non-Hispanic population. We see increases for the Black non-Hispanic population. We see that for other groups, and then for the Hispanic population as well, we also see increases here. So again, this accessibility project is sort of showing these broad-based benefits across the full demographic makeup of the region. This pie chart illustrates the data feature in the DEI module that shows education attainment and what types of jobs are created for varying levels of educational attainment. So here we see that the majority of the jobs created by this project require no bachelor's degree, and that a smaller portion of jobs are created for those with bachelor's degrees and above. So I enlarged these numbers because they can be kind of hard to see in this presentation. So employment by occupation and education, we see an increase of 5,356 jobs with no bachelor's degree, and an increase of 2,245 jobs for those with a bachelor's degree and more. Here we are looking at labor force participation by race. So we are seeing that more white non-Hispanic people are being brought into the labor force. There's also a pretty noticeable increase for Black non-Hispanic people being brought into the labor force. And again, we see these broad-based benefits, but broken down into the specific demographic components of the region. That was the graph that showed racial breakdown. This graph shows the gender breakdown. So we see that more jobs are created that will be likely filled by male identifying individuals, but also increases for female populations as well. Compensation by industry shows a noticeable increase in compensation for the lowest 20% and the second 20%. income quintiles, which again are sort of the intended beneficiaries of such a policy, although broad-based benefits, every quintile here is appearing to benefit. Looking at income distribution and looking specifically at compensation rate change, we see that after the first year of this project, we see an increase for the lowest 20% and lowest 20% and the second lowest 20% income quintiles. So we see we see a rise in compensation rate. Here we can see a measure of inequality based on the compensation rate changes. Looking at all regions, we see a decrease in inequality, a small decrease in inequality, an increase in the city of DC's, the DC city inequality that increases over the time horizon, whereas in Maryland and Virginia, we see the decrease in inequality, which shows up when we look at the decrease across all regions. So to emphasize the fact that this particular project was simplified and we were really focusing on the accessibility component, we made that decision because it was a pretty intuitive example showing how land use, transportation, accessibility projects can have these broad-based benefits across the region, and that DEI policy challenges can be improved by providing more transportation choices and increasing mobility, so that there's more opportunities across the region. But this being a more simplified example, we would like to kind of dive into a more complex example next to show the more complicated trade-offs and economic complexities that happen in real-world policymaking scenarios. So oftentimes the macroeconomic implications that decision makers need to take into account are complicated. There's winners and losers in policy situations. There can be potential tension with DEI policies and other policy priorities. And so to show this, the fact that the REMI model can capture these more complex dimensions of policy, we will simulate a revenue neutral policy change. So because it's not necessarily crystal clear how to achieve broad-based prosperity, even though we can pretty commonly agree that that is the goal, there are competing economic narratives that lay out how best to reach that broad-based prosperity. So limited government is clearly one of those narratives, meaning low taxes and fewer regulations. An example of this that proponents of a limited government economic narrative might point to would be the Trump Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which provided stimulus to the economy by deficit-funded tax cuts. And in Q4 of 2019, we saw the unemployment rate drop to 3.5%, the lowest rate since 1969, and we saw the unemployment rate for Black and Latinx groups at record lows. However, the other economic narrative of active government with higher taxes and government services and regulations, that narrative believing that active government is the best way towards achieving broad-based prosperity. An example that proponents of this narrative would point to might be the high growth rate in the big government post-war economy after World War II, so 1946 through 1980. And the fact that that growth rate was faster and more widely distributed than the post-Reagan era. So these competing narratives obviously indicate that policy scenarios are more complicated than a win-win-win situation for everybody involved. So the example we will look at here will be a revenue-neutral example of home healthcare subsidies. And the expectations here are that the jobs will be predominantly filled by women and people of color, that these jobs will be available to lower income quintiles. And we will model this by funding government subsidies through a property tax increase. And looking at this property tax increase and these subsidies, we will model the differential impacts on groups in the region and show some of the benefits and trade-offs of a policy like this. So the reason we're focusing on home healthcare subsidies as an example in this scenario is because home healthcare is a very quickly growing industry. There's increasingly more demand for home healthcare as the population ages. Options other than nursing homes and care at hospitals are increasingly appealing to aging population, and especially considering post-COVID, more people are more interested in receiving at-home care. Also, subsidies to this industry are intended to be job creators. So because of the COVID pandemic and the groups that were most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, including women, Black and Latinx demographic populations, this policy will aim to create jobs for those groups specifically. Also, just to note that women are already disproportionately affected by elderly relatives because women tend to be the caretaker of these relatives even when they're not participating in the labor force, and that labor is not paid. So this is why we're focusing on home healthcare, to sort of give a visualization of the breakdown of this industry. We see that the gender breakdown is really overwhelmingly female. And this data is coming from the American Community Survey from 2014. So an overwhelmingly female industry. We see that the racial and ethnic breakdown of the industry is 42% white, again, as of 2014, 28% Black or African American, and 20% Hispanic or Latino. I'd also like to draw our attention to educational attainment. So the majority of these jobs, over half, require a high school degree or less, and 36% require some college, and only 10% require a bachelor's degree or higher. So policymakers, in this scenario might expect that this will increase employment for women, as that's a goal of the policy, and it's a very female-dominated industry. They might expect that this will increase employment for Black and Latinx demographic groups. They would expect that this policy change would create more jobs for those that don't have bachelor's degrees and create jobs accessible to lower income quintiles. So in this scenario, we will be looking at the city of St. Louis and the greater St. Louis, Missouri region, metro region. We did this analysis in a greater St. Louis metro area DEI model. The model scenario is, again, to fund these home healthcare subsidies with a property tax. And the specific model inputs we used were $100 million home healthcare subsidy for the city and $100 million in property tax increases to reach that revenue neutrality. Again, we'll be looking at the time horizon of 2021 through 2030. Looking at our economic summary here, we see more complex results than we saw in our transportation accessibility example. Overall, we see a growth in total employment, although at a smaller scale than previously in the previous example. We see a rise and then a fall in GDP. We see fall in personal income. We see essentially what this table will capture is more of the complex trade-offs and impacts of this policy change, with it being revenue neutral. So to dive into kind of why these summary numbers are happening, we'll look at some graphs and some results from the DEI model. Here we see employment by industry. Clearly there is a large increase for the lowest 20%, so the lowest income quintile here. Of course, that was kind of expected because we mentioned that these jobs are most likely going to go to the lowest 20%, and this is what we're seeing happening here in the model. And we're seeing small increase across all industries because of this big jump for the lowest 20%. Again, I would like to emphasize that right now we're looking at the region of St. Louis City. Later we will look at the region as a whole, but this is for the city. Continuing to look at the city, Here are the employment by demographics as a result of that policy initiative. We see that employment for Black non-Hispanic individuals increases. We see that there are other sort of smaller increases across the demographic groups, but overall increase in employment. And again, sort of reaching that goal of the policy that was to create jobs for, at least for Black and non-Hispanic groups. We also see some increases for the Hispanic group as well. Looking at employment by gender, we see large increases in jobs for women, large increases in employment for women. Again, to be expected because this is an overwhelmingly female industry. And we see too that more jobs are created by this policy that do not require higher education. So there's around, let's see, there's 1,145 jobs created for those with no bachelor's degree, and around 704 created for those with a bachelor's degree and above. Looking at labor force participation rates by race in the city of St. Louis, we have decreases for all groups at varying rates. So negative impacts to the labor force participation rate in the city of St. Louis specifically. Looking at participation rates by gender, we see decreases, especially for males, but we see it for both male and female, again, in the city of St. Louis. So a reason for why we're seeing this drop in labor force participation would be because of this phenomenon of economic migration out of the region, out of the city. So we see the loss to St. Louis City itself, as this is the jurisdiction where the property tax has been increased, but we see increases in migrants moving out to the greater St. Louis area on the Missouri and Illinois sides. So essentially people are moving out of the city to escape that property tax. Looking at compensation by industry, we see large or the largest increase in compensation for the lowest 20%. And we see the largest drop in compensation by industry for the second lowest 20% or the second 20%. And this is capturing the fact that these subsidies that were intended to go to the lowest 20% are in fact going to that quintile more than the others. And we're seeing that there's some harmful impacts on the second 20%. Looking at compensation rate changes, we see the largest negative impact occurring to the second 20%. And we're seeing only some small increases for the lowest 20%. So the compensation rate impact of this policy is really impacting the second 20% most negatively in this scenario. Here, looking at compensation rate inequality, we see an increase in inequality in the city of St. Louis. To take it back one slide, a reason for this could be a reason that is captured in this graph is the fact that these subsidies are intended for the lowest 20%, and so that's where the benefits of this policy is going. However, the second 20% is not seeing the benefits of these subsidies, but are bearing the brunt of this property tax increase. So the loss to the second 20% is much more pronounced because they're not seeing the benefits of the subsidies. And that would be why a possible reason why we're seeing this compensation rate inequality increase. So that was, a lot of different moving parts going on in that scenario. So to kind of summarize some of the complexities and trade-offs we saw with this home healthcare subsidy example, we saw migration out of the city of St. Louis to the surrounding region, which caused that labor force participation decrease across all demographics in the city, but saw those increases for the greater St. Louis region. Again, we saw that change because people were moving away from the city to avoid that increased property tax. Compensation by industry increases for the lowest income quintile and increased slightly overall, but the subsidies benefited the lowest 20% income quintile. The compensation rate dropped for the second lowest income quintile, and we saw that slight rise or smaller rise for the lowest income quintile. And we ended up seeing, sort of as a result of that, the increase in compensation rate inequality, because the second lowest quintile does not see the benefits of the subsidy, but does face the cost of the tax. And the benefits of the subsidy to the lowest quintile are not offsetting the cost of the tax across the whole population. So to sort of tie it back to that transportation accessibility example, that was a hypothetical scenario that didn't really capture the costly trade-offs of potential policy changes, whereas our home healthcare subsidies example went a little further into illustrating the real-world phenomenon of winners and losers in policy change. And the biggest takeaway from the second example that I'd like to highlight are the fact that policies do have potential unintentional effects, and that there's a real value for economic modeling to help decision makers plan ahead and understand the impacts of a policy before they implement it. The solution to such complex policy questions is where REMI comes in. We are the only widely available economic model that will account for these DEI issues. Our current clients include a variety of organizations, Sandia National Labs, University of Michigan, TVA, NEA, and many more. Our model is authoritative, so we use standard metrics to evaluate public policies, and we are academically peer-reviewed, and our equations are publicly available. Our model applications are not limited to policies that may initially seem that focus specifically on DEI. We also look at all different kinds of policy analysis, and so, you know, even a policy that is not necessarily explicitly DEI will have important DEI impacts. So I wanted to emphasize kind of that breadth of capabilities that we have here at REMI. Finally, to sort of tie this presentation up, wanted to emphasize why economic modeling matters. The REMI model helps inform policy with standard metrics rather than ideology or intention. Our modeling helps address or helps our clients address stakeholders with evidence, communicating how policy benefits or disadvantages their communities broadly. And the key piece here of these DEI impacts are that economic modeling can help decision makers understand the economic and demographic implications of policies before implementing them, so that public policy truly does serve the broad-based interest of the public without disadvantaging or benefiting certain groups disproportionately. So at this point, I'd like to thank everybody for the time and for coming to this webinar, and I will turn it over to our question and answer segment of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Katy.